There was once a man in southern Vietnam who spent money like no one else. Throughout his lifetime, it is said that he squandered the equivalent of 5 metric tons of gold. 5 tons. Enough to build a city. Enough to feed thousands of families for decades. Yet for him, it was nothing more than fuel for pleasure. Fuel for nights of music, luxury, and excess. Who was this man, capable of burning through a mountain of gold? And what did his life ultimately become? To understand this man, we must first return to the early 20th century, to the fertile rice fields of southern Vietnam. This was a land where wealth was measured not by coins, but by hectares of rice paddies. At the heart of it stood one of the richest landlords in all of French Indochina, a man who owned tens of thousands of acres of farmland. His harvests brought in wealth so immense, it was said he could fill warehouses with sacks of rice and vaults with bars of gold. And from this empire of abundance, a son was born. A boy who never knew hunger, never knew limits. From the moment he opened his eyes, he was surrounded not only by servants and estates, but by the intoxicating sense that money would never run out. His father, eager to give him a taste of the modern world, sent him abroad to study in France. There, in Paris, he absorbed the sophistication of European life, the cafes, the fashion, the allure of modern luxury. He returned to Vietnam with the posture of a prince, the confidence of one who had seen the world, and the belief that anything could be bought with wealth. This was no ordinary heir. This was a man who would soon redefine what it meant to spend. When he returned from France, the young heir was no longer a nameless son of the South. He had a name that would soon echo across the Mekong Delta, Tran Trinh Huy. But history remembers him by another title, a title that has survived in whispers for generations. He was the legendary playboy of Bac Lu, the man whose wealth, arrogance, and flamboyance would become a cultural symbol of extravagance in Vietnam. Dressed in Parisian suits tailored to perfection, polished shoes that gleamed under the tropical sun, and hair combed with the precision of a movie star, he carried himself like royalty. In Saigon and Cholon, where French officers, Chinese merchants, and Vietnamese aristocrats crossed paths, his presence was impossible to ignore. He drove imported cars at a time when even bicycles were a luxury for most. When his car rolled down the wide boulevards, people stopped to watch. Men muttered in envy. Women stole glances of admiration. To many, he looked less like a landlord's son and more like a prince of the modern age. And he lived as if the world was his private theater. At the Continental Hotel in Saigon, he rented entire halls just to host parties that glittered with champagne and music until dawn. The city's elite gathered around him, basking in his radiance, intoxicated by the sense that they were standing next to someone untouchable. One evening, he summoned an entire Kai Luong troupe to Bac Lu, not to perform for a packed audience, but for him and a few companions. For hours, the stage belonged to his whims. Songs were repeated, scenes replayed, simply because he commanded it. It was clear now. Tran Trinh Huy was not just living with wealth, he was performing with it, turning money into spectacle and himself into legend. The tales of Tran Trinh Huy's extravagance soon spread like wildfire, each story more unbelievable than the last, yet all too real for those who witnessed them. One night in Saigon, surrounded by wealthy friends and French businessmen, he made a wager that would become legend. Another man boasted about his fortune, claiming no one could match his daring. Huy smiled, reached into his pocket, and pulled out a crisp banknote. Without a word, he struck a match and set it aflame. The note curled, blackened, and vanished into smoke. His rival, unwilling to be outdone, did the same. A second note disappeared in fire, then a third. the room filled with gasps, the scent of burning paper thick in the air. They went back and forth, burning note after note, until the floor was littered with ash. But Hui did not stop. With a laugh that silenced the hall, he pulled out a larger bill, struck another match, and let it burn slowly between his fingers. The message was clear. He had more to waste than anyone could imagine. That night was remembered not for music, not for wine, but for the spectacle of money itself turned into dust. And it was not the only time. In Bac Lu, he hired a French pilot and rented a plane, an impossible luxury at the time, not to travel but to circle endlessly over the town. The roar of the engine made villagers rush outside, pointing at the sky in awe. They had never seen such a thing before, and inside that machine, Hui sat calmly, as if the heavens themselves were his playground. On other nights, he turned entire hotels into his private playgrounds. He ordered champagne by the crate, wines by the barrel, and musicians who played until their hands ached. He would scatter banknotes on the floor so that servants could step on money instead of dust. To him, the spectacle was everything. The cost was nothing. And then came the Kai Luong Theater. One evening, he summoned a full troupe, not to perform for the masses, but for himself alone. For hours, they sang and played only for him, repeating his favorite song until their voices grew hoarse. He paid them more than they would have earned in a year, all for a single night's amusement. All of this, every flame, every bottle, every note of music, was part of a life where money existed only to vanish. And when people tried to calculate it, they realized that over the years, these pleasures, these whims, these contests of pride had consumed the equivalent of 5 metric tons of gold. 5 tons turned into smoke, laughter, and fleeting memories. A fortune larger than empires, scattered like dust in the wind. If money was his stage, then love was his game. Tran Trinh Huy was not only rich, he was strikingly handsome. Tall by Vietnamese standards, with sharp features and the confidence of a man who had never heard the word no. In the ballrooms of Saigon, where the elite gathered beneath chandeliers, he was always the center of attention. Women in silk dresses whispered his name long before he arrived, and when he finally appeared, the room tilted toward him as if pulled by gravity. He courted women the way he spent money, lavishly, recklessly, with gestures so grand they bordered on absurd. One story tells of a young actress from Saigon, whom he pursued by showering her with gifts every day for a month, jewelry, imported perfume, even silk dresses shipped directly from Paris. Another recalls how he once paid for an entire riverboat cruise, filled with musicians just to serenade a single woman under the moonlight of the Mekong. His romances were brief but intense, like fireworks that lit up the sky before vanishing into darkness. For him, love was never about permanence. It was about the thrill, the conquest, the satisfaction of knowing he could have anyone he desired. And women, drawn to his wealth and aura, often surrendered willingly, swept away by the fantasy of being with the most extravagant man in Vietnam. But there was a darker side. His love affairs left trails of broken hearts and rumors of betrayal. Some women spoke of his charm, others of his cruelty. To many, he was both a dream and a warning, proof that desire, when fueled by endless wealth, could burn just as hot and just as destructively as fire. Even so, his legend only grew. Because in every whispered story of passion and heartbreak, the name Playboy of Bac Lu shimmered brighter, like a forbidden jewel no one could resist speaking of. For years, it seemed as if his wealth had no end. 5 tons of gold could buy endless nights of champagne, endless flights into the clouds, endless love affairs under the moonlight. But history is relentless, and even mountains of gold cannot stand forever. The world around Tran Trinh Huy began to change. The turbulence of war shook southern Vietnam. Political upheavals disrupted the very system that had sustained his family's fortune for generations. Land was seized, power shifted, and the endless rice harvests that had once filled his vaults no longer flowed as before. But even as the empire crumbled, Huy did not change his ways. He continued to spend, to live as though the world owed him a stage and an audience. Yet slowly, inevitably, the gold that had once seemed infinite began to dwindle. There were whispers in Bac Lu, quiet at first, then louder. The once mighty playboy was not as untouchable as before. Hotels where he had once thrown lavish parties no longer opened their doors at his command. Friends who had basked in his glow drifted away, chasing other suns. And so, the man who had once seemed larger than life began to fade. No longer the shining prince of Saigon ballrooms, no longer the ruler of Bac Lu skies, but a man confronting the shadows of his own past. He had burned 5 tons of gold into smoke and laughter. And now, when the lights dimmed and the crowds dispersed, he was left with the silence of a life that had spent everything. In the end, Tran Trinh Huy's life was not remembered for the fortunes he lost, but for the way he lived. He died not as a king surrounded by gold, but as a man who had burned through it all. Yet his name refused to fade. In Bac Lu, people still whisper his story. When someone spends recklessly, they say, he spends like the playboy of old. His legend became more than gossip. It became a metaphor, a symbol of extravagance carved deep into the cultural memory of Vietnam. 5 tons of gold may have vanished, turned into smoke, laughter, and fleeting nights of music. But the story of the man who wasted it all survived, told and retold across generations. For some, he is a warning, proof that wealth without restraint will eventually consume itself. For others, he is a dream, a man who lived with no limits, who turned life into theater and himself into myth. And so, long after the gold was gone, the legend of the playboy of Bac Lu endures, shining not with the luster of riches, but with the timeless glow of a story too extraordinary to forget.